Hello, I'm Malte Lierl and I'm a political scientist at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. The study I'm presenting here at the Advances with Field Experiments conference is called Can Elections Reduce Embezzlement? It is about the way we select public decision makers and its consequences for governance outcomes. As you know, elections are a very common method of selecting public decision makers. Presumably, that is so because people believe that elected leaders will govern better than, for example, leaders who were picked at random from the population. But empirically speaking, we don't actually have much of evidence in favor of or against this assertion. If we look at the existing research literature, there are only a few experiments that have compared elections to other methods of leader selection. And those have mainly focused on legitimacy and leadership effectiveness as outcomes of interest, where elections do indeed seem to have certain advantages over other institutions. However, when it comes to corruption outcomes, and specifically embezzlement, we only have inconclusive results. So the story seems to be more complicated here, and to understand better, we'd have to unpack the causal mechanisms through which elections could affect corruption outcomes. So, what are these hypothesized causal mechanisms? Very prominent in the discussion are re-election incentives, and there is some evidence that re-election incentives can reduce corruption. Another mechanism is lying aversion. Elections involve campaign promises, and there has been shown that promise making affects social preferences and behavior later on. In this paper, I'm looking at three additional causal mechanisms. One is selection effects, that is, are elected decision makers intrinsically less corrupt than non-elected decision makers? The other is social norms and sanctioning behavior. Are people more willing to punish elected decision makers for embezzlement than non-elected decision makers? And the third concerns people's beliefs about corruption. Do citizens have more accurate beliefs about corruption by elected or non-elected decision makers? And what does this imply for the impact of information and transparency? So to answer these questions, I carried out a field-based behavioral experiment with 472 groups of citizens in Burkina Faso. The experiment is built around a pretty straightforward decision situation. Each group has a group fund. This group fund is supposed to be split equally among its members. However, there's a decision maker within the group who is able to embezzle money from this group fund. And the group members can reward or punish this decision maker at a cost to themselves. The logic that this decision situation captures is fundamental to many problems of governance and accountability. Decision makers face trade-offs between the interests of their constituents and their personal advantage. And they're formally or informally accountable to their constituents so they can be sanctioned for their choices. Now, in the context of this decision situation, there are two cross-cutting experimental manipulations. First, it is varied whether the decision makers are elected or randomly appointed. Second, and only after the decision maker has been selected, it is also varied if the decision maker can hide embezzlement or whether it is transparent. And here's what I find. Overall, elections significantly reduced embezzlement only if embezzlement was transparent to group members. My main interest, however, was not in this aggregate effect, but in the underlying causal mechanisms. Here, we see something very interesting. First, about selection effects, which I measured using study participants' pre-treatment embezzlement preferences. Here, I find that elections systematically favored pro-social candidates. This is interesting because study participants were mutual strangers and were only given 10 minutes of group discussion to get to know each other. So that's potentially good news about elections because it suggests that citizens are well capable of electing leaders who are less corrupt than the average person. Next, I look into sanctioning behavior. Here, the goal was to compare how elected and non-elected decision makers are sanctioned for a given level of embezzlement. So basically, if elected decision makers had embezzled exactly as much as non-elected decision makers, would they have been punished any harder? The answer is yes. For medium to high levels of embezzlement, elected decision makers are punished significantly more severely than non-elected decision makers. This is really important because it tells us that elections are conducive to accountability, not just because of re-election incentives, but because people are more willing to incur costs to punish norm violations by elected leaders. finally, I looked into beliefs about embezzlement. In the absence of transparency, how much do people think that their decision maker embezzled? Here, I find that for randomly selected decision makers, people have pretty unbiased beliefs that are, on average, very accurate. For elected decision makers, however, people severely underestimated actual embezzlement. So, elections cause people to be way too trusting towards decision makers. And that can be a problem because elected decision makers may be more pro social on average, but that doesn't mean that there aren't individual elected decision makers who are very selfish. And if those leaders know that they get a trust bonus for having been elected, they can exploit that to their advantage. So if this short presentation made you curious, I hope you check out the research paper. And don't hesitate to be in touch with questions or comments.